Hey everyone, Mr. Chamberlain here. Some confusing language has started to pop up in describing geography. And I wanted to make sure these three different ways of referring to geography make sense to you. They are the world zones, they are these expressions of the old world and the new world. And the other set of expressions includes the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. Let me see if I can explain how those are related. World zones is our old big history project way of thinking about the world. That after those human migrations, tens of thousands of years ago, the world seems to sort of settle into the Pacific Island societies, which are here and here, and Australasia, which is connected to some extent there and connected to Afro Eurasia, but for the most part, probably more isolated than connected. We have this absolutely massive world zone, Afro Eurasia, that we've spent a lot of time talking about. And we, of course, also have the Americas. And the Pacific Island societies and Australasia are probably smaller players in this very, very big world stage. And what we're seeing happening with the Columbian Exchange is that recreation of Pangea, where this part of the world is coming in touch with this part of the world, and by extension with the rest of the world. So it's this bridging of the Atlantic Ocean. This idea that Afro-Eurasians didn't even know that these places here existed because they were actually trying to get to this part of the world the long way around, and they end up finding these new continents. Now remember, new only matters in the context of an Afro-Eurasian perspective. To the people who called the Americas home, these weren't new locations at all. So that's an important piece of the story. What starts to happen as we're talking about this then is that people who are leaving Afro-Eurasia find what they call the New World. Since they didn't know that these continents existed and these cultures existed, the expression, they used a Latin term for it, but the expression they use is the New World. And by extension then, this part of the world becomes the Old World. So those expressions are still used today. Now, they're a little bit strange because Native Americans have been living in the Americas for tens of thousands of years, maybe even longer. So the idea that this was new doesn't make any sense from their perspective. But we still use those expressions today, referring to this half of the globe as the Old World and this half of the globe as the New World. Now, here's the other thing. When you are doing longitude, there's a line that slices through Europe and Africa. It slices through a city near London, which is where the Royal Navy and the King hundreds of years ago made the decision that that's the starting point for measuring. So that line, as you may know, that very special longitude line is called the prime meridian. And everything to the east of that line is called the Eastern Hemisphere, the eastern half of the planet, and everything to the other side of it is called the Western Hemisphere, or the western half of our big planetary sphere. Can you guys do the stems on hemisphere, half sphere? So, in a weird way, this prime meridian sort of gets moved in our minds hundreds of miles to the west for convenience sake. And Africa, Europe, Asia, even Australia and the Pacific Islands are referred to as the Eastern Hemisphere. And everything on the other side of it, across the Atlantic, which is North and South America or the Americas, is sometimes called the Western Hemisphere. Even though a close analysis tells us that Europe and Africa, or parts of Europe and Africa, are actually in the Western Hemisphere, we don't actually refer to it that way. So it's almost like the Western Hemisphere and the New World are almost the same thing, and the Eastern Hemisphere and the Old World are almost the same thing. We can broaden this further with our thinking and say that this is sort of Eastern Hemisphere and the Old World might be ways of referring to Afro-Eurasia, our world zone, and the Western Hemisphere or the New World might be ways of referring to that world zone, the Americas. So try not to get confused by that language. Hopefully that's helpful.